never give in. Never, never, never.
Could I ask you now about your involvement with the auxiliaries, and perhaps first of all to ask you about your father and how he...
Well, of course, when the Home Guard started in the town, I think my godmother's husband was one of the prime movers, and also another gentleman we used to share the Devon cottage with. And Dad, they were sort of three prime movers in the town, really, because it was quite a small town in those days. And they sort of had their LDV armlet, and I don't know, I think Dad had a 12-bore. Well, I think the three of them had a 12-bore. And of course, the Home Guard gradually evolved, and Dad had Home Guard uniform. He was a major, I think, because he was battalion MO, and he used to disappear in the evenings to ostensibly do first aid lectures. Anyway, we were a bit surprised that whenever they had a parade in the town, that Dad would never parade in uniform. He always went in civvies. And it wasn't until long after the war that I realized, that it was because he was in the Home Guard uniform was just a cover. Of course, a doctor was in a very good position if there was an invasion, because he would obviously be given a permit and petrol to visit his patients, and he could keep an eye lifting for troop movements, places that were likely places to bomb or put out of action in some way, like railway stations and post offices and banks, that sort of thing. And the next thing was we had a television transmitter and receiver put in the air raid shelter in the garden underneath the floorboards. Well, that was in full view of the front gate, and although it was a very quiet road then and there was very little traffic, it was thought that it was too vulnerable for people walking past to wonder why we were rushing down into the air raid shelter when there wasn't an air raid.
It was under the floorboards of the air raid shelter, was it?
Yes, there were duckboards on the floor, and they put a metal cover under the duckboards, and then a sort of metal box for the transmitter. Anyway, we also had a gardener who was, I think he had tuberculosis, and he used to sort of work part-time in the garden when he felt well enough. Well, of course, he got suspicious about what was going on in the air raid shelter, so he had to be brought in and sign the Official Secrets Act. And then they had the brilliant idea of putting the wireless set in the cellar under the house. It had been a coal cellar, and there was a coal chute from outside for them to tip the coal that went down the chute into the cellar. So they blocked off the opening and made it look like the rest of the paving of the backyard. And in the place where the coal used to go down, they fitted the transmitter, and the cellar was made to look like an air raid shelter for the poor Brits frightened of the German bombing, It was cleaned up considerably, and the spiders were removed, and it was lime washed, a few chairs, one thing and another. And in front of the transmitter and receiver, they fitted a an asbestos sheet with an electric stove on it. And on the right-hand side, there was a little narrow place where you could fit a very thin knife to lift a catch, which would release the asbestos sheet, and with the stove on it, lift that out, and there was the transmitter behind it. The aerial was very cleverly led up a nearby chimney, very high up and rather, a chimney that you didn't really notice a lot. And the aerial was on there looking like a lightning conductor. And we had sheets of cipher papers to copy out when we sent messages through. And neither my sister nor I could remember how often the codes changed. I sort of had a feeling that there were sheets for each day, and they were changed. We had a fresh set every month. Somebody else said they thought it was every week, but we've never been able to remember which it was.
But they were changed, were they?
They were definitely. Oh yes, they were changed quite reasonably frequently. Of course, it had become impossible for us not to know anything, so my sister was married and she was away at the time with her husband, but my mother and I had to sign the Official Secrets Act, and, we were taken in. I was spending spare time breaking in horses for people because there was nobody else to do it. And I had this sort of affinity with horses. I seemed to be able to, do more or less anything with them. The only problem being, of course, when they went back to their owners, they didn't behave as well as they should have done. But, of course, doing that, just a girl, and after all, in those days we were very unsophisticated, I was able to keep an eye lifting for troop movements and, again, anything that might be worth bombing. And, of course, nobody, would be likely to, was thought not likely to suspect a 15-year-old riding around on a horse. And I could get through the woods and along the fields and that sort of thing, where troops were often camouflaged, and that would all go back as a practice for if there was an actual alert.
And so when you say it would go back, you would actually send a message?
It would be sent through, yes.
Would you do it yourself?
Generally speaking, either Mum or Dad did them. It was sort of in their hands, really.
And that would be in one of these codes, would it?
Yes. All had to be coded. We never knew where it went to, of course. We never knew anybody else who was functioning on this. I never knew who recruited my father for it. I just don't know whether the military approached him. I never knew. It was all very hush-hush, because if we didn't know anything, we couldn't, in the event of an emergency, we couldn't tell. I mean, they could torture us as hard as they liked, but there was nothing we could tell.
That's an interesting point, is it? Because I suppose, had there been an invasion, you would have been arrested as a spy, would you not?
Yes.
And
they found out if they found our set. But the interesting thing I only learnt quite recently was that the way the set was constructed, as far as I'm not very understanding about these things, but I think it worked on 2 wavelengths. And unless they could find the 2 wavelengths, the Germans would never discover it. And I think they have managed to reconstruct one because at the end of the war, or when the auxiliaries were stood down, the whole lot were collected up and dumped down a coal mine. They never kept one for history. And there was one gentleman left who had been in the making of them, and he eventually managed to help the scientists at one or other of the universities to reconstruct one of these sets. And I presume it's still as impossible to find as it was then. But it was a very clever system, because any time anybody's asked me about it, they said, well, of course the Germans would have got onto your set in a minute when you were transmitting. And I said, well, there was some reason why they couldn't. And then it was very recently that John Warwicker told me roughly how it was done. Every now and again the soldiers came and changed the batteries, and they used to get a soup and cheese lunch, which made our place fairly popular.
Would that have been caused suspicion with your neighbours, soldiers coming?
You see, the house was very isolated. Here we've got houses fairly close, but in those days we were surrounded by fields, and it was a very quiet road. There was one farm about half a mile past, but most of the traffic went to that along this road. So there was, they wouldn't really have realised, and there were troops messing about. There were troops in the town, billeted in various places, so anybody seeing a couple of soldiers driving into our place would probably think they were billeted with us. So, it was much easier.
So really it was your father, your mother and yourself involved in this as a little team, as it were, a nucleus of this.
Yes.
Who was Mr. Collins?
Oh, Major Collins is subsequently Colonel Collins. He was the coordinator for the area, and he had to go around visiting and making sure that everything was working okay, and that we were okay with any of the latest information. And of course he was in the Enniskillen Dragoon Guards, and I rather gathered that pre-war there was a polo team which functioned in Germany, mad Englishmen playing polo, and of course they were all with their eyes open seeing what was going on with Germany rearming. He had a lovely Alsatian called Mark, who was a very famous dog, actually. He was a Belgian police dog who, by certain underhand means, came into John's ownership. And he was beautifully trained, and I had him for a while to look after when John was supposed to be going on a course. And I had him for, many weeks. Supposed to have him for 6 weeks, but he was with me for a lot longer. And I was told I wasn't to let him get into the car before I got in, because otherwise he wouldn't let me in. I think that lasted about 48 hours, and he was as good as gold. He let me in. I had to be introduced to him, and, he was told, now this is your mistress, you guard her, and you do as she tells you. and he went everywhere with me. I was sleeping in a downstairs room at the time, and there was a spare bed which Mark slept on, until one wet night when I had flu, my mother came to take him out for a last pee, and it was a very wet night. It was pouring with rain, and Mark took one look at it and said, "No, I'm not going out." And so he came back and he got on my bed, which was alongside the wall, and he got between me and the wall. And he wasn't going to move, and Mum went to get him by the scruff of the neck and said, "Come on out." And he grabbed her and snarled, and drove her off. And I slapped him hard, and I said, "You wicked dog, go on out for a walk." And he looked at me, and he sort of shrank into his skin, so to speak, and crawled off the bed and went outside into the drive and came galloping back very quickly. He was amazing, because one time I was riding into the woods, and there was a whole collection of military vehicles camouflaged in the woods, and a couple of soldiers came along and sort of, were chatting, wanting to chat me up, and I decided I needed to get away. So one of them got hold of the horse and said, "Oh, you don't need to go yet." I said, "I do," and I said, "Mark will make you let go of that horse." So, "Mark? Who's Mark?" I said, "You'll find out." I said, "Mark, attack." And Mark went for them, roaring at them. They let go in a hurry. And funnily enough, they were John's regiment. So I never knew whether they knew him, but I imagine he'd been seconded onto this work, as soon as he came into the country, after the German episode.
Yes, I can imagine you were at risk, going in woods with troops.
Yes.
Particularly sort of camouflaged places.
Yes.
An attractive young girl on a horse.
Oh yes, it was quite fun, but the horse was very useful to get out of the way. I had the old black fellow, and I also had an Arab stallion, a chestnut, that I used for most of my spying work in the daytime, because he didn't show up so much as a black horse.
Was it mainly in the daytime that you went, that you did your
Yes,
spying?
when we had exercises, we were out at night, but that was principally for message carrying. But at one point I was nearly rumbled when I was carrying a message at night, about 2 o'clock in the morning. The man came, and I was hiding under some rhododendrons, and the man came up and leant against a tree and lit up his pipe. And if you can imagine, you want to sneeze, you want to cough, And because I didn't know who he was, you see, they said that there would be people out to try and catch us. And I didn't know whether he was one of the people who was out to catch us, or whether he was a gamekeeper, whether he was a poacher. I couldn't see him. I could just smell the tobacco. Anyway, eventually he knocked his pipe out and went off. And I'm afraid I didn't spend any more time trying to find where to put the message, because the messages were put into a pipe. They were put in a tennis ball that was split open, and the message was stuffed into the tennis ball. And then they ran down this pipe to the operations room, wherever it was, down underground.
Would you have known where they were, the operations room?
No, you knew where the drop place was, but that was all. Anyway, after that they decided, perhaps, I think at Dad's behest really, they decided that night work wasn't the thing. Although knowing the area so well, I could get across country, with just crossing roads. And that was the thing one had to be careful of, that you didn't get caught as you crossed the road. And they said they would question us pretty closely as we would have been questioned by the Germans if we were caught.
By the British authorities?
Yes, they would, want to know who you were and what you were doing. And it's fairly difficult to think up an excuse for what you were doing riding a horse at 2 o'clock in the morning.
It's quite a challenge for a young girl. You were 16 at the time?
Yeah, people have said, weren't you frightened? I said, no, it was, in some ways, it was all a game. And then when you thought about it, well, it was your war work, apart from the farm work. And I suppose one was too young to think about, what it might be like if the Germans did come.
This whole issue of the auxiliaries, could I examine that? Could I get you to tell me about this? There had been genuine fear of invasion in this country.
Yes.
And when did this come about? Would this have been Dunkirk time or before?
I think it was always at the back of one's mind because we'd been disarming for so long. And, of course, it came out very quickly that the Germans had been arming away quite happily in secret. And they'd got a huge air force of modern planes, whereas we'd got Tiger Moths and Gloucester Gladiators and, dear old planes that would stay alive, would stay aloft, whatever you did with them, but they weren't exactly battle planes. And although there were planes like Hurricane and Spitfire in the making, we weren't ready to repel a German invasion. And it was always felt that if Hitler did make up his mind, there was really nothing to stop him. I was amazed to see that, at the beginning of that film that I was on the end of, to realise what provisions had been made to slow down an invasion, because they couldn't stop it. But the incredible things that they'd done all along the coast and inland to slow down the troops until we could mobilise our own smaller troops to repel them. And I was also amazed that both Germany and this country, having studied all this, realised that, in fact, the Germans would have been thrown out. It takes a bit of believing, because we thought, we were there, thought that we had nothing to stop them. But in fact, there was, if you've studied that film, you'll see there were the most incredible collection of tank traps and guard posts and great concrete blocks, ditches, dikes, you name it. There was everything you can think of, which in themselves wouldn't have stopped an invasion, but they would have slowed it down, they would have prevented the tanks from being as effective as they had been on the continent. And we were, in fact, much better prepared to stop an invasion. But we didn't know that at the time. I didn't know there were one or two roadblocks down here. I remember one at Ingworth. There was a pillbox disguised as a straw stack. And there was a sort of big tree trunk fastened at one end and on a wheel the other end to be wheeled out, and some barbed wire. Well, all the tanks would have done was to have gone round it. We really used to rather laugh at it, ruefully. But in point of fact, there was a lot more. I think the spies in Germany before the war, had discovered where the invasion plan was to be, and in point of fact, the Germans can't have realised just how easy Norfolk and Suffolk would have been to invade. They'd made all their plans for the south. So actually, our plans in this part of the country were very Heath Robinson and very haphazard.
So you started your work when, am I right in thinking in 1942, would it have been, when you left Cheltenham, or were you still at Cheltenham?
No, I was still at Cheltenham. I was doing, in the holidays. I forget which year it was, but I know, John Collins said, I could be very useful with the horses. I think he had more because he was keen on horses and he liked coming over to ride Monarch.
So would it have been about 1940 then, the time after Dunkirk, about that
Yes.
time, would it? You would have been very young at that stage,
Yes.
weren't you? 14,
Yes.
14? Yes. 14
Yes, it
years.
was
Yes, I suppose, as you said earlier, no one would
14,
suspect
15.
a schoolgirl
No,
on horseback.
no.
How about this issue of secrecy when trusting someone as young as yourself? Being in a boarding school like Cheltenham, I imagine there was a chat with girls and there's sort of stories. What you were doing was very exciting. Was it tempting to tell your friends what
Never thought about it. Never thought about it. Such a completely different environment. We did read. We were in our air raid shelter, which was in an inside passage of a reinforced concrete boarding house. And one bomb dropped one side of us and one bomb dropped the other side of us and went straight through one of the boarding houses which the government hadn't derequisitioned, because they requisitioned the whole of the college and all the boarding houses to take government to. And the principal, Miss Popham, had a fortnight to find accommodation for 900 girls and 100 staff. My year and the year below us went up to Lillishall Hall in Shropshire. Some of them went to Brockhampton, some to Seven Briggs House. I forget the others, but they took over various different years, were accommodated in various different big country houses. Sort of worthy out. We were about just over 70 miles from Cheltenham. Popham used to drive up. I think she came once a week to make sure everything was going all right. And she would go the rounds, have a meal with us, talk to us all, and then back again, and then she'd be going round one of the others. And then eventually the government decided that I think they thought Cheltenham was probably too vulnerable. So they started giving it back. They gave back 2 boarding houses, which were these 2 reinforced concrete ones, St Austin's and St Helens. St Helens was the day girls' house, and their dining was sort of in the middle part of the house. We were all boarders in St Austin's. And they gradually gave back more of the houses, but this particular one, Bays Hill House, they hadn't back. And when we went down to college in the morning, there was Bays Hill House. The bomb had gone through the building. And a few days later, when Miss Popham was in the press, I have some news for you. Bays Hill House has been requisitioned by the need. I inform the government that I'm not prepared to accept its petition. She had a very naughty little smile, sort of walked up one side of her mouth. And of course there was hoots of joy all under the Princess Hall. Quiet, please. It is not a subject for hatred. Yes.
Cheltenham at that time.
Yes, because Cheltenham was believed to be, well, that's why the government got to go there, because the Germans would never get there. But of course they had gone, it was a hit and run raid. They'd gone for the Gloucester aircraft factories, and this one plane had obviously got driven off and dumped its bombs on the way home.
And did the school manage to keep its identity during this time of
Yes.
dispersal? Did you all feel,
Oh, yes.
Cheltenham ladies?
Yes, Miss Popham was a marvellous person. I don't think anybody's ever realised just what a fantastic person she was. We all thought the world of her. There's the odd girl who said, oh, Popeye this and Popeye that, but the large majority of us, there was a terrific feeling of one big family.
And going back to the invasion theme, after things began to pick up in the war, after El Alamein and Stalingrad victory, you still carried on these activities, expecting invasion, did you?
Apparently, I'd gone into the WAF just almost when the war was almost finished. I was a radar operator. And they were stood down sometime then, but I never knew the date, because I never knew until long after I was married that we had in fact been stood down.
But was it still taken seriously, the work you were all doing, expecting that perhaps the Germans might come in 43 and 44?
Oh, I think it was right up until the time they realised there was no threat of invasion. After we invaded the...
Did you yourself use the radio?
On one or two occasions, yes.
And was it quite a simple thing to operate?
Yes, it was just a question of knowing the right buttons. But that sort of thing, seemed to come naturally to me, because with the radar, I found I picked it up. I was on the old CH stations, which were being superseded at the time, but we had a 200-mile range, which the more modern stations only had about 50 miles. And so we could see planes coming from much further away, and a warning could go out. I got so that I could recognise the German planes because they had this funny little wiggly trace that went across, and I could tell the German planes from the shape and colour of the thing, and I could tell them, when they were sort of about 150 miles, I could say, it's a German raid coming in. And
where were you stationed then?
Most of my time I spent at Stoke Holy Cross, just outside Norwich.
Messenger. You were saying you had a chestnut stallion.
Yes.
And your black one, which you used for your night rides.
Yes.
Did you? Yes, that they were very lucky to have someone like you with your riding experience and the horses.
Well, I think John Collins spotted it. You see, he realised that from the point of view practical knowledge and sensible attitude that I was, I suppose, fairly unusual.
Ideal, an ideal candidate. Well, you must have been by far the youngest recruit.
Oh, I would think so, yes. I mind you, I don't know, because we never knew anybody else. I remember Dad saying that, and he'd heard that there was one vicar who had his set in his belfry, because of course the bells were not allowed to be rung, you see. And I'm almost certain that would have been the Reverend Humphrey Berkeley at Southrips, because from his belfry you could see out to sea, and he would be an ideal place to spot.
And his name was Berkeley?
Yes, Humphrey Berkeley.
Oh, yes.
He was subsequently chaplain to the Queen, but he was a lovely man. He always had a horse and he hunted. I remember before Godfrey and I married, we went, he said to Dad he'd seen my engagement in the paper. And he said, "You're descended from Parson Jack Russell, aren't you?" Dad said, "Well, yes, he was my mother's great uncle." So, yes, he said, "Sporting parson." He said, "Your daughter should be married by a sporting parson." He said, "I will marry her." And of course there was a certain amount of annoyance by the local vicar, but anyway, he did.
Very appropriate.
And we had to go over to see him and have lunch. And after lunch, he said, "Right, now we'll go across to the church." He said, "It's rather a lovely church. I'd like you to see it. We can have a chat over there." And on the way, he said, "Oh, I'll show you the nearest thing to an angel on earth." And he'd got a Labrador with him. He opened a stable door, and over the top of the door came a greyhound. And both of them, and a terrier, they all came into church and sat down. And we were sort of a bit surprised. And he said, "Oh, dogs always used to come to church." He said, "We've even still got the dog tongs that we used to separate the dogs that had fights in the middle of the service." And he said, "We've got quite a lot of rings still left that dogs were tied to." And, we had a little chat then, and off we went. But I've never forgotten, when we went to the gate into the churchyard, a little side gate, he was making the greyhound jump backwards and forwards over the gate.
You were saying you didn't know the other people. Have you since learned of other women involved in this?
Well, there's one lady I'm still friendly with who was, I think she was in the Fannies at the beginning of the war. And she was a radio operator with the ATS and with the army.
But not in the auxiliaries?
No.
No, I was wondering...
She was on the other end of our
was she?
job, you see. And also she was trawling the wavelengths to pick up any foreign speech. And I said, "Oh, did you, see if there are any spies?" I said, "Did you ever get any?" And she said, "Well, I never knew, definitely. But," she said, "I did pick up 2 lots of somebody speaking German." But he said, when we did that, we had to switch it straight through to headquarters. And they acted on it.
And did she know of the auxiliary role? Did she
No.
know that? No, she wouldn't.
Not till after the war.
She would just have been, doing her job.
Yes.
Normally.
Yeah.
Yes.
She didn't know where she was either. She was stationed. She didn't know where she was stationed. She was taken there in a lorry. And her place of operations was a hut with a tin roof in a wood, and she was picked up by Army lorry and taken back to her billet, and that was her life. She hadn't a clue where she was.
Yes, we ought to talk to her, it seems. Yes.
She's down in Sussex now.
Perhaps later on I could
Yes, I've got her name and address.
That would be the other thing.
She's very, very crippled now.
Oh.
Yeah.
I was wondering, were you ever taught to defend yourself?
Yes, I learnt rifle shooting and revolver.
Did that come easily to you?
Yes, not so much the rifle shooting, but the revolver. I found I was pretty accurate.
And would you have carried one with you when you went out?
No.
That would have been in case of invasion.
Yes. Yes, we went down to the Marsham. There's a rifle range down there, and we went down there to learn rifle shooting. I had 2 sessions, and 2 sessions with a revolver.
And also, bearing in mind the risk you ran if there was an invasion, because after all, if you were caught and interrogated, you would have been a spy. Am I right in thinking that?
Well, I remember laughingly saying to John, "What happens if they decide that I'm a spy?" He said, "Well, you'll be put up against a wall and shot."
And you knew that, did you?
Yeah.
That you would be shot. And you were still prepared?
Well, I suppose one felt it was such a remote possibility. You know, we were sort of fed by the government that we were fully prepared to repel an invasion, etc., etc., etc. So I, in my innocence, believed them.
Your father must have been under quite a lot of strain, I think.
He was much more... He didn't talk about it, but I know, or sort of clued up.
More involved
Yeah.
in the... And he never spoke about it?
No.
Yeah. Did this happen for a long time, that everyone kept very quiet about the...
Yes, well, you see, I never talked about it. I mean, I was married in 1948, and I'd been married quite 10 years before I discovered that we'd actually been stood down and it was all right to talk about it.
You kept quiet all that time?
Yeah.
Yes.
But funnily enough, my husband was in the bombing squad in the Home Guard, and they were the ones who would act on the clues that we came up with. They had their hideout in the woods because they were farming at Bennicker Hall Farm then in Suffolk, and they had a hideout in the woods, underground, hidden, you know.
Oh, so he would have been an auxiliary.
And in the event of an invasion, he would have had to go to ground and stay there, and just come out when they...
Those hideouts, are they still about?
It's a funny thing. I came across, at Aylesham's show, I came across the Highland mare that I've got now, who'd come to the show with her daughter, who was being shown, and Mummy would just come to keep her company. Mummy was standing around grazing outside, and I was talking to another Highland judge who was there, and I said, you know, if that pony's missing from her field in the morning, I said, they'll know where to look for her, because I said, I've always wanted one that colour. So I said, Miss Mitford would have lent me one. And I think I'd switch over a minute, I'll have to leave you.
Accession number 29234, reel number 4.
Jill Monk, Real 4. And you were telling me about hideouts.
Oh, yes.
Hideouts, yes.
Well, this Scottish gentleman said, "Oh, actually, that old mare is looking for a home because they've got the daughter, and so they want to find a home for mother because she's surplus to requirements." So I got the name and address and wrote and said I had a half-bred Irish draft and I was unable to ride it at the time because I was having terrible trouble with my back. And I thought it was rather fun to have a Highland pony to breed from, which my niece in Devon, who breeds them, had been pushing me and saying, "You don't want to have those great lumping Irish drafts. You know, you ought to have a Highland pony." So anyway, the long and short of it was that they came over to have a look and the Irish draft in exchange. So I took her over to their place in Suffolk and back with Jonah. And we became quite friendly. I'd known Colonel Crisp's mother. She used to bring and show Welsh riding. And so there was a sort of connection, you know. And I went over there. When I was over there, I got red pearl cattle. They've been instrumental in really popularising the red pearl again. And what I heard, and I used to milk sometimes during the war, if a certain farm where they had red pearls, if they were stuck, and managed to help out. I couldn't. They were awfully hard milkers, but I could manage a few to help out. And we were talking about the auxiliaries, and I was saying, you know, my husband had been in the bombing squad, and he was asking me, as you have, you know, about the auxiliaries and what we did. And he said, "Now then, some of the land I've just taken over, we've found an underground hideout of some sort. Looks like 2 Nissen huts buried." So I said, "Oh." I said, "Do you mind if I give your telephone number to a friend of mine, John Warwicker, because I know that they are hunting for one of these hideouts in this area, and they haven't been able to find it." So I put them in touch with each other, and sure enough, it was the one they were looking for. And I think they've closed it off, you know, now because it's getting unsafe. I suppose in time the corrugated iron has rusted away, probably. But anyway, it was interesting that, you know...
Did you see it yourself?
No, I've never seen it. No, I always wanted to, but I've never seen it.
But it was 2 Nissen huts, he thought.
That's how he described it to me. He said it looked like 2 Nissen huts buried underground. But
there must be quite a few in this area, I would think.
Oh, I imagine there were.
Yes.
But
yes.
we never knew. I didn't know until after I was married, you see, that such things existed.
Did you find out also other people that were involved that you surprised you later on?
No, I remember there was a gentleman down in the West Country whose son took over from Colonel Collins when he went on, because when I had Mark, I discovered that John wasn't on a course at all. He'd been dropped in occupied France to soften up, the Marquis, to tell them what they wanted put out of action in the way of railway lines and such like. Because he was trilingual, and he was born in Paris, and he spoke fluent French and German.
So he would have been SOE, would he?
And well, who knows? As far as we knew, he was just getting the Green Guards, and that was it. And he was supposed to come and pick Mark up, but he didn't come for a long while after he was supposed to come. Didn't hear anything from him. And then there was a phone message from his batman who said, "Oh, I've got to come and pick Mark up." I said, "Oh, is the colonel not coming?" "Oh no, he's very sorry. He's too busy to get away. He was stationed at Spilsby in Lincolnshire." So the batman duly came, and I said, "Oh, sorry the colonel couldn't come. I thought perhaps he'd make the effort to come over and have another ride." "Oh, he said he couldn't ride at the moment. He's got lumbago, and he isn't half making a fuss about it." It was years later I discovered that actually he'd nearly been caught by the Germans picking up the Lysander to bring him home. And I think he'd been in a fairly bad shape when they got him back. But it was comparatively recently I found out about that.
And did Mark, you mentioned earlier he was a famous dog.
Yes.
So did he go to France?
No, he was with me. But he went with him on the invasion.
Oh, did he?
And he was with him, yes. He was used for ammunition carrying. He had 2 leather pouches like panniers, and he also was used to swim across rivers with a rope so they could get a bridge across.
So he was
he was a marvellous dog.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, the gain I only knew this in the last 2 or 3 years, that he was... I knew he'd been wounded before Dunkirk, but he was wounded again during the invasion, and this chap said he lost a leg the dog did. And he was used because John was over there with BAOR. He said, it was really horrible having to punish people for pinching a bit of food or something, some old was starving. But he did, they put on shows, which funnily enough I'm finding out with the book that I'm reading now. They put on shows for the German people. And they did a little pantomime, a sort of Red Riding Hood thing, where Mark rescued the girl from the brutal German soldier, you see. And then after the show, Mark went round with his ammunition pouches for the troops to put money in to buy things for the German people. But when he died, he was buried in the garden of a house. I thought it was in Hamburg, but I couldn't be certain. But the German people put up a little statue of an Alsatian dog and an inscription on the stone that it stood on was Mark, a true friend, in German.
That's a very interesting story. We have an exhibition at the museum
Yes.
on animals at war. And this will really be a very interesting story
Yes.
for that.
He was a wonderful dog because he, during the retreat in France, the chaps that John was with were able to sleep and get some sleep at night because Mark was always on guard. And the colonel in charge got wind of this, and so he thought he'd catch them out. He didn't realise about Mark, but he knew that they were having a kip when they should have been on guard. So he crawled up a ditch nearby where they were parked. And unfortunately, Mark got at him and took the seat out of his breeches, not to mention a certain amount of the colonel.
Well, no wonder you enjoyed having him.
Oh yes, he was a gorgeous dog. He really was. I've always longed to have an Alsatian since. But the British Alsatians are such wet things, and they've bred them with their hind legs bent, so that when you see them standing, their head is here, and their bottom is somewhere down here, with these terribly bent hind legs. And I've always thought that temperaments were peculiar, and it's just coming out quite recently that the army and the police are having to buy foreign dogs because the British Alsatian is so effete, they're being bred for show, that they're no use. When they were using them, they'd, for argument's sake, a litter of 7 pups, and they might get 1 through. The rest were rejects. They were no good.
Because the Germans used them a lot in the war.
Yes.
The SS.
Yeah.
They were very fierce.
He actually came from Belgium. Mark, he was a Belgian dog. He was huge. He was the size of a Shetland pony. He was a great big dog. He stood about that height.
That's at least over 3 feet, isn't it?
He wasn't a dog to tamper with.
Going back to your duties again, am I right that you had set exercises when you were a messenger? That you would.
Well, every now and again the troops would have a troop exercise with all the local troops and RAF regiment, all on the alert for an imaginary invasion.
And were you involved in any way with that? Were you watching and recording that?
Well, we knew that at one point our set was supposed to have been knocked out, and so I had to go out to Hempstead to take. That was when the man came and smoked his pipe, and I went cross country out to Hempstead and tied the horse up on a gate a little way away, and sort of hid him in the woods, you see, and then went further down.
That must have been very frightening to be in the woods with a man. And the horse, was the horse quiet?
Yes, he was very peaceful, and he'd had a good long ride beforehand. He was glad of a rest.
Yes, would you have been mounted, or did you get off the horse?
I got off him and tied him up well away from where there was another gate further up from the gate where I went in or over, and I took him into the wood and tied him up in the wood. And then I went down to the other gate and went in to find the drop place.
The message in the tennis ball.
Yes.
Yes. I was also going to ask you about the codes. Have you any idea what sort of system was used? Did you use full words, or were the letters mixed up?
I think it was letters, because we had to send messages rather like a text message now, very, very shortened.
Yes, so it would have been a sort of shortened word.
Yes.
Yes. But the code part would have been the arrangement, would it,
of the letters? Yes.
Yes, I see. Yeah. Was that fairly easy for you to grasp and do, the technical part?
Yes, as long as you didn't get disturbed. Because the trouble with the doctor's house, you'd get the phone going and have to go and take a message. That was the only annoyance. Then you'd lose track of what you'd done.
Yes, and did you have to be very careful about concealment every time? Having had your asbestos...
Well, we hadn't had any staff in the house then.
So you could actually just leave it, could you?
Well, no, it was put away out of sight. Mum had a big black bureau in the dining room. We had this wonderful great refectory table that Dad had designed with the stretcher underneath. Instead of the straight one that you got your feet stuck on, it was a Y shape at each end, and the plank went down the middle. So you didn't get stuck trying to get close to the table. And we used to spread the codes out on the table and do them, but they were kept in Mum's bureau in one of the drawers. All the sheets.
So your mother was involved throughout the war like your father?
Yes, she was. Well, when we got the radio set, she was drawn in because she had more time, or supposed to have more time to do the decoding and the coding up.
How about this gardener? How did you deal with him, your gardener, who was rather suspicious?
Oh, well, he was not exactly morose, but he was typical Norfolk, but he didn't talk unless he was spoken to, and he didn't use two words if one would do.
So he was ideal?
Absolutely ideal. And because he was TB, nobody would go near him. The family and everybody kept away from him. I don't know whether he actually lived alone or whether he had a mother who kept house for him, but it did eventually catch up with him, unfortunately, and he got him in his brain.
Were any of you paid for doing this work?
Good Lord, no.
Or expenses, any
No.
expenses or extras?
No. No, good heavens no. I'd been insulted if it had been offered.
Is that so? You were doing it as a duty?
No, it wasn't a duty, it was something we wanted to do. We were volunteers. I mean, we felt it was something that we could do, you know. We weren't able to fight, so it was the next best thing.
You did your bit.
Yeah.
Did you get any recognition for this at any time?
No.
Not a medal, a defence medal?
They said that I wasn't doing it for long enough, and they had no record of Dad. So I couldn't even get his posthumously.
I suppose by the very nature they might not have had a record with the...
Well, John Warwicker a few years back came over to see me and he said, "You told me your father was in the Home Guard." I said, "Yes, he had a major's uniform and he was battalion MO to all the Home Guards around." Well, he said, "I can tell you something, he wasn't in the Home Guard." I said, "I hate to have to mention it, but he was." He said, "Here are the lists of all the Norfolk Home Guard groups, battalions or whatever they were." He said, "Your father's name is not on any of them." So I said, "Well, that's peculiar." But I said he had... I've seen the uniform, seen him going out in it. So then he said, "Well, these were all printed lists." He said, "I've got a handwritten list of about 12 names. And the last one on the list was either A.G. or R.G. Holman. Now, an old-fashioned A can look a bit like an R. And I think that was Dad." I said, "That was Dad because he was A.G. Holman." He said, "Well, these were the chaps who were auxiliaries using the Home Guard as a cover. And that was why Dad would never parade in uniform when they had sort of Wings for Victory and, all the rest, all these sort of parades of all the Red Cross and the Brownies and the Scouts and one thing and another. He always went in civvies."
And was he operational throughout the war, your father?
Well, I know he was one of the prime movers with the Home Guard to start with, when they were the LGV.
Do you know when the set went? Did you have any idea when your set was taken, as you say, to be dumped in a coal mine?
Well, I wasn't there then because my sister came home because she was having a baby. And because I asked her about the codes, but she had so little to do with it that she'd had to sign the Official Secrets Act, but she had so little to do with it that she didn't really remember anything except the chap who took over from John was known as the Chocolate Soldier because he was always bringing them bars of chocolate.
Thank you very much indeed for telling me, so much about your war experience, both in the auxiliaries, in the WAF, and about your family as well, because it's all part of the...
Yeah.